Seungri did not look like the kind of star who would ever run out of luck. He looked like the kind of man who understood exactly how fame worked and how to stretch it further than anyone expected. Inside BigBang, he was the youngest, the loudest in a different way, the one who knew how to turn being underestimated into charm. Outside the group, he cultivated something even more dangerous than popularity, the image of a man completely at ease around money, nightlife, business, and access. He did not sell himself as fragile, mysterious, or artistically tortured. He sold himself as fluent. Fluent in power, fluent in people, fluent in the glamorous machinery that turns celebrity into influence. That was what made him feel so modern for a while. He looked less like an idol trapped inside the system and more like someone learning how to profit from it. And that image was intoxicating because it suggested control. It suggested that Seungri was not just surviving fame, he was mastering it. But that was also the first warning hidden inside the fantasy. Because when a man starts looking too comfortable around privilege, pleasure, and access, the public eventually begins to ask a darker question. Does he understand the game? Or has he started believing the rules no longer apply to him? That is where the real tension in Seungri's story begins. His downfall was never shocking simply because a celebrity got caught in scandal. It felt bigger than that because the scandal did not destroy a random image. It reversed the exact image that had made him compelling in the first place. The confidence that once looked clever began to look predatory. The social ease that once felt impressive began to look contaminated. The ambition that once made him seem sharp and hustling began to look like appetite without limits. Suddenly, the same qualities that had once made him appear successful, modern, and untouchable started reading as symptoms of something rotting underneath. That is why Seungri's story does not land like a simple celebrity fall. It lands like exposure. Like the moment a fantasy of fame, money, nightlife, and access is forced to reveal what it was hiding all along. Because the real story was never just about one idol getting too close to scandal. It was about a man who seemed to enjoy power so much that at some point, he no longer looked like someone carrying fame. He looked like someone consuming it. Before he became Seungri, before the club headlines, the business image, and the confidence that would later look almost too comfortable around money and access, he was just Lee Seung-hyun, a boy from Gwangju with the kind of hunger that entertainment industries know how to exploit and reward at the same time. He was born in 1990 in Gwangju, South Korea, long before the stage name, long before BigBang, long before the public learned to associate him with glamour and scandal. And that matters, because no one begins as the finished image they later become trapped inside. They begin as ambition in motion. For Seungri, the ambition seems to have arrived early. The industry he was moving toward did not reward quiet patience. It rewarded visibility, performance, and the ability to make yourself impossible to ignore, even when you were not the strongest, oldest, or most naturally commanding person in the room. That is where the first shape of his future image begins to appear. Not yet corruption, not yet collapse, just appetite. The kind of appetite that can look admirable at first because it reads as drive. The kind of hunger that makes a young person seem fearless, entertaining, and determined to climb faster than anyone expected. But hunger is always dangerous in a system that teaches people attention is power. Because the earlier you learn that being noticed can change your life, the easier it becomes to believe that more visibility, more access, and more influence will always mean more control. Seungri's story would later become much darker than ambition alone. But ambition is still where it begins. That hunger found its real form when he entered YG Entertainment and debuted with BigBang in 2006 as the group's youngest member. Inside a lineup as dominant as BigBang, Seungri was never going to command attention the way a leader or main creative force might. So he had to build a different kind of value. He learned to survive through energy, timing, charm, and usefulness. He was the youngest, but he understood early that youngest could be turned into a role if played correctly. Lively, social, eager, funny, sharp, always ready to fill the space that older, more intimidating members left open. That is what made his entry into stardom more important than it first appears. He was not simply joining one of the biggest groups in K-pop. He was learning in real time how personality itself could become leverage. BigBang's rise after debut made all 5 members larger than ordinary idols. But Seungri's position inside that success was especially formative because it taught him something that would define his public image for years. If talent gave you a place in the room, charm could help you move around, inside it faster. That is where the deeper seed of his later arc was planted. Not in scandal yet, but in the intoxicating lesson that access could be earned, expanded, and enjoyed. Long before the collapse, Seungri was already becoming someone who looked less interested in fame as admiration and more interested in fame as mobility. The ability to go where others could not, meet who others could not, and turn celebrity into a wider form of power. That was the beginning. And it would matter later more than anyone wanted to admit. For a while, Seungri's rise looked like a success story built on adaptation. Inside BigBang, he was never meant to dominate in the obvious way. He was not the group's most intimidating figure, not the member most strongly associated with artistic genius, and not the one audiences instinctively read as the center of gravity. That is exactly why his rise mattered. He learned how to turn a weaker position into a useful one. As the youngest member, he built value through energy, timing, confidence, and an almost restless social intelligence. In a group that became one of the defining acts of K-pop after debuting in 2006, Seungri found a way to make himself memorable, not by outshining the others on their terms, but by creating a different kind of public function for himself. He became the lively one, the socially flexible one, the one who could move easily between stage persona, variety energy, and the wider entertainment world. That kind of usefulness is powerful because it makes a person feel bigger than their official role. Over time, Seungri stopped looking like just the matinee of a legendary group and started looking like someone who understood how to build a personal brand inside a giant machine. That was the first real breakthrough in his image. BigBang gave him scale, but Seungri turned that scale into a more specific identity. Not simply an idol, but an idol who looked unusually comfortable with the business side of fame, the social side of fame, and the pleasures fame could unlock. In that version of the story, his ambition looked modern. It looked practical. It looked smart. He was not just surviving celebrity, he was learning how to monetize it, widen it, and enjoy it. That is what made the next phase of his rise so important, and so dangerous in hindsight. As BigBang's influence grew, Seungri's identity also expanded beyond the group itself. He pursued solo music, variety appearances, business ventures, and a public image increasingly tied to nightlife, entrepreneurship, and access. He did not present himself as the tortured artist or the quiet celebrity disappearing behind fame. He presented himself as someone who knew how to live inside it. That distinction changed everything. For many fans, it was entertaining. For the public, it made him seem unusually savvy. He looked like the idol who had figured out how to move through powerful rooms, how to talk to investors, how to build a life that extended beyond the stage. But that is also where the mythology around Seungri started changing shape. He was no longer just the golden youngest of BigBang. He was becoming something more volatile, the man who seemed too fluent in access. And access is seductive because it looks like control. The clubs, the business image, the networking, the confidence, all of it made him appear like someone rising faster and wider than a normal idol should. For a while, that image was part of the thrill. He seemed to embody a fantasy of celebrity that was not only glamorous but mobile. Fame that opened doors, money that extended identity, influence that made rules feel negotiable. That was the hidden trap inside Seungri's rise. The higher he climbed, the more his image stopped being about admiration and started being about appetite. And once appetite becomes central to a public persona, the line between ambition and excess can disappear very quickly. The collapse in Seungri's story did not feel shocking only because scandal arrived. It felt shocking because, once it arrived, it seemed to pull meaning backward through everything that had come before it. For years, Seungri had been able to live inside an image that looked almost untouchably modern. The youngest member of a legendary group who did not just understand fame, but appeared to understand how to turn fame into movement, money, and influence. He looked comfortable in rooms that made other idols seem out of place. He looked too fluent in nightlife, too fluent in business language, too fluent in access. And for a while, that fluency was part of the appeal. It made him seem sharper than the average celebrity, more adaptable, more socially powerful, more aware of the machinery behind the glamour. But that was exactly what made the later fallout so devastating. When the Burning Sun scandal exploded, the image did not simply crack under pressure. It reversed. Every trait that had once made Seungri look impressive suddenly became suspicious. Confidence stopped looking like charisma and started looking like entitlement. Sociability stopped looking like networking and started looking like contamination. The businessman aura stopped reading as ambition and started reading as appetite. That is why the scandal around him never felt like an isolated disaster. It felt like exposure. It felt like the moment the fantasy of a man who knew how to win inside celebrity culture was forced to reveal what kind of world he had actually become comfortable inhabiting. Burning Sun did not just damage Seungri's reputation. It changed the grammar of his image. Things the public had once admired were now reread through danger, vice, and moral rot. And once that reversal happens, there is almost no way to go back. The audience does not just lose faith in the person, they lose faith in their own earlier reading of him. That is what makes the fall feel so ugly. It is not only the destruction of a star, it is the humiliation of realizing the signs may have been there all along. That is also why part 4 of Seungri's story has to be understood as more than a legal timeline, even though the legal consequences matter. Yes, there were investigations, headlines, public outrage, a retirement announcement in March 2019, court proceedings, conviction, a reduced sentence, imprisonment, and release in 2023. But if the script only lists those events, it misses the darker emotional truth underneath them. The deeper tragedy is that the scandal did not destroy an image unrelated to the allegations. It destroyed the exact fantasy that had made Seungri culturally legible in the first place. He had been sold not as innocent, but as savvy. Not as morally spotless, but as street smart. Not as sheltered, but as someone who could move through pleasure, nightlife, and influence without ever losing control. That is why the scandal felt so terminal. If a star built on innocence gets caught, the public experiences betrayal. But if a star built on fluency, appetite, and access gets caught, the public experiences something colder: recognition. The image does not break because it was false in every direction. It breaks because it suddenly becomes too legible in the worst possible way. Seungri's public identity had always flirted with the fantasy of a man who knew how the world worked better than everyone else around him. Burning Sun stripped away the glamour from that fantasy and revealed the uglier possibility underneath, that he had not simply learned how the system worked, but had become far too comfortable in the darkest parts of it. That is why retirement did not feel like a dramatic twist. It felt inevitable, like the final stage of an image that could no longer survive contact with what it had come to represent. By the time prison entered the story, the symbolic collapse had already happened. The legal punishment only hardened what public perception had already decided. Seungri was no longer the clever, hungry Maknae who turned ambition into power. He had become one of the clearest examples of what happens when ambition loses every remaining break and access starts to feel like immunity. In the end, the pressure in his story was never just, "a scandal got too big." It was that the scandal exposed how much of his rise had already been leaning toward excess, and how thin the line had always been between his charm and the appetite that finally consumed him. And in the end, what remains of Seungri is not the image he spent years building, but the wreckage left after it collapsed. The youngest member who once looked fluent in fame, money, nightlife, and influence no longer exists in the public imagination as a symbol of modern celebrity success. That version of him is gone. What remains instead is a name attached to one of the ugliest scandals in modern K-pop, a case study in how quickly charm can curdle when it has been fed too long by access and appetite. After announcing retirement in March 2019, Seungri never returned as an idol in any meaningful sense. Later court proceedings, his prison term, and his release in 2023 only hardened the finality of that fall. By then, the symbolic death had already happened. The stage lights, the Maknae persona, the playful confidence, the businessman image, none of it could survive what the public now understood those things to have been orbiting. This is why his story does not end with redemption, transformation, or a haunting kind of survival. It ends with absence, with the sense that the person who once seemed to know exactly how to move through the system ended up becoming one of the clearest warnings about what the system can hide when ambition stops recognizing limits. That is why Seungri's legacy feels colder than tragedy. A tragic ending still leaves room for pity, for complexity, for the painful sense that something beautiful was lost. But Seungri's story leaves behind something harsher. It leaves behind the feeling of exposure, of glamour stripped down until nothing remains but its rot. He is not remembered now as the hungry youngest member who fought for space inside a giant group. He is remembered as proof that some public images do not fall because the world was unfair to them. They fall because eventually the world sees them clearly enough. And maybe that is the final truth of his story. Seungri did not just lose fame. He lost the fantasy that had made his version of fame appealing in the first place. The confidence, the fluency, the access, the appetite for bigger rooms and looser rules. All of it stopped looking impressive and started looking dangerous. That is what makes his story linger in such an ugly way. Not because it is mysterious, and not because it ends beautifully, but because it shows how thin the line can be between a man who looks like he knows how to win and a man who has already been consumed by the thing he thinks he controls. In the end, Seungri is not the story of a star who broke under pressure. He is the story of a public image that, once fully exposed, could no longer pretend to be anything but a warning.